This is the Endgame Gear OP1 AK V2. Endgame Gear's follow-up to the legendary OP1 AK I reviewed almost 2 years ago. Now compared to the OP1 V1, not much appears to have changed here on the V2, as many of the mouse's specs and features remain the same, but under the hood there have been a lot of improvements to the mouse's hardware and accessories, and these changes make the V2 a much more well-rounded mouse compared to its predecessor. Additionally, my original review of the V1 wasn't as in-depth as I wanted it to be, so I figured this would be a perfect time to give the V2 the full in-depth review the V1 deserved, and talk about the optional switch packs EGG was kind enough to send over with the mouse as well. So in today's episode of the mel0n review, we're going to take a deep dive into the OP1 AK V2, and we'll talk in depth about the mouse's performance, features, accessories, pros and cons, and most importantly, whether the V2 can carry on the legendary legacy set by the OP1 AK V1. But before we get started, a big shout out to Endgame Gear for sending over the OP1 AK V2 and its switch packs for review. They also sent over the brand new XM2W4K V2, a mouse I've been trying to get my hands on for several years now, so keep an eye out for that review as well as a full teardown of the OP1 AK V2 coming very soon. And a massive thank you to our channel members who directly support what I do here. If you enjoy the content and want to support my work, consider becoming a channel member, as that is the best way to directly support the channel, and being a channel member gives you early access to all upcoming content. And as always, this review will be completely unbiased, meaning you'll get my honest opinions of everything I cover here on the channel, with no affiliate codes, brand bias, or paid promos. But without further ado, let's get right into today's episode of the mel0n review. For testing parameters, I used the OP1 AK V2 for about a week and a half, testing the mouse for both work and gaming use on both soft and hard pad types. Through the testing period, I briefly used the half-size and full-size stock skates, but opted to remove them and use aftermarket skates that were more optimized for hard pad use, as that's the pad type I tested the mouse on for the majority of the testing. And for firmware, the mouse was tested on version 1.06, the latest firmware version available at the time of this review. For versions, the OP1 AK V2 is available in 3 colorways: black, which has a black shell and black buttons, white, which has a white shell and black buttons, and dark frost, which has a semi-transparent shell and buttons, and all of these colorways retail for $89.99 USD, and today I'll be reviewing the white colorway of the V2. For packaging, the mouse comes in the same packaging style that was used for the V1, which is a great thing to see in my opinion, as not only does the box list all the mouse's included accessories, it also lists the mouse's estimated weight, dimensions, and spec details for all the mouse's components, which is something a shocking amount of brands don't do, and something I love to see as you know exactly what you're buying, unlike other brands' products where 98% of the time you're left to guess at what switches, encoder, or MCU the mouse uses. Opening the box by sliding the top off the base, we're met with a large cardboard insert which houses the OP1 itself, which comes wrapped in a plastic bag and the mouse's cable is wrapped around it. Removing the mouse and the cable from this insert and removing the plastic bag, on the mouse's base we'll find a pre-installed set of smaller surface area or hybrid skates, the same type we saw pre-installed on the V1's base, which also allow for easy access to the base access screws, allowing you to open the mouse without damaging the skates. Next, removing this cardboard insert, in the bottom of the box we'll find a small paper envelope which contains the rest of the mouse's accessories. The first of which is a set of grip aids, which just like the ones included with the V1, only include side covers, which is a rather unique style of grips to see included, but we'll talk more about their unique design and performance later in this video. Next we'll find my favorite accessory included with the OP1 series mice, a small Phillips head screwdriver. We've seen other brands include screwdrivers with their products, but for whatever reason they're either insanely small and hard to use or really bad quality, but the one included here is very nice and sized decently well, and just as I said when I reviewed the V1, including a screwdriver with the mouse is a great statement of sorts here, as it not only speaks to the mouse's fantastic serviceability and modability, but we'll talk more about these aspects in a bit. Next in this packet we'll also find a small rubber cable wrapper, which is another great little accessory to see included here, as well as an extra sheet of full-size skates which have little holes milled into them, allowing you to install the full-size skates on the mouse mouse's base without impacting the mouse's serviceability, unlike almost every other mouse on the market, which is yet another great attention to detail I'm very happy to see carry over from the V1. And lastly, we have a compliance manual and quick start guide, both of which are multi-language, and the quick start guide outlines the mouse's key features, functionality of the base mode button, and even includes a diagram showing how to open the mouse and swap the switches, something I wish more brands would include with their products, as it makes servicing or recycling the product easier for customers. And for warranty coverage, the OP1AK V2's warranty will vary depending on the region you reside in, so check Endgame Gear's website for more information on the mouse's warranty for your respective region. Alright, that is everything for the mouse's in-box accessories and unboxing. Next I want to quickly talk about the optional switch packs that Endgame Gear was kind enough to send over along with the mouse. The first of these kits are replacement PCBs and Kale GX switches, which are available for $6.99 USD. But these switches have been binned, giving them a slightly lighter actuation force than the stock switches, so if you have a V1 or V2 and one of the main switches wears or fails, or you just want a lighter click, you can replace them easily without needing to purchase a whole new mouse. The second option is the ever popular Universal Switch Pack, which is available for $19.99 USD and includes 2 hot swap main click PCBs and a bunch of extra switch types, which you can use to customize the OP1's click feel to your preference, or to utilize other switch types with the hot swap PCB. This kit works with both the V1 and V2 versions of the OP1AK, but does not work with the wireless ones, and we'll talk more about the hot swap PCBs and these extra switch types later in this video. Before we move on, a quick note about the mouse's wired usage. For some reason, there is this stigma about wired mice in today's market, which I frankly don't understand, but every time I talk about a wired mouse, there's always one person saying wired sucks, go wireless, it's better, which is an incredibly outdated perspective, as you have to consider the fantastic performance offered by the OP1 V2 and all of Endgame Gear's other wired mice for that matter, is due to its wired nature, as the wired connectivity allows the mouse's components to run at their peak speed without the power optimizations that are forced on wireless mice's components. And for the people who say the wire impacts performance, without a bungee I totally agree, but with a proper bungee and a proper setup, the wire is a non-issue and offers a usage experience basically akin to a wireless mouse as long as you give the cable enough slack, that is. So just because the OP1 V2 is a wired mouse, please don't write it off, as the cable is a non-issue in my opinion and is the key to the OP1's industry-leading performance. As a preface to this segment, keep in mind that my unit was sent to me directly by Endgame Gear, so take the build quality and QC of my unit with a grain of salt. But that said, just as we saw in the original OP1AK, the build quality of the V2 is sublime, as both the top and base shells are rigid without any creaking or flexing to them. The mouse's internal build quality is also amazing too, as it uses modular PCBs which are connected to the main board via JST connectors, which makes modding or repairing the mouse extremely easy, but we'll talk more about this in a moment. But one noteworthy change here on the V2 is that while the structure of the top and base shells is very similar to the V1, here on the V2, the main PCB is significantly smaller, which I have to give major props to Endgame Gear for, as the engineering required to make this PCB so small while having superior performance to their previous mice is very impressive, and the PCB in its stock configuration is moddable, as you can cut off the back part of this PCB to reduce its weight and footprint, though doing so will remove the functionality of the mode button. And on the topic of PCBs, both the main PCB and all the daughter PCB soldering quality is perfect, with no noticeable issues from my inspections. For QC, just like the mouse's build quality, the V2 feels essentially perfect, as the mouse's buttons are very well implemented across the board and well balanced in terms of their actuation weights, though the scroll wheel is noticeably heavier than the one found on the V1, which can take some time to get accustomed to, but overall the QC of the mouse is good, with no noticeable issues from my testing. And as a note here, the Frost versions of the OP1 series and Endgame Gear's other mice did have some QC issues due to the top and base shells creaking, but Endgame Gear has told me those issues are resolved on the newer batches, so if you were holding off on getting the Frost version due to the issues that were there before, they should be free of them now. For weight, the OP1AK V2 is advertised as weighing around 49.5 grams, which is a slight improvement over the 50.5 gram V1, but Endgame Gear isn't providing a plus-minus gram ratio on these weight specs, so I assume the industry standard of plus-minus 2 grams is going to apply here, giving the mouse an estimated weight spec of 49.5 plus-minus 2 grams. Now my unit in its base form weighs around 48.2 grams, but it is difficult to get an exact number due to the cable's weight, but around around 48.2 grams was the average for my measurements. And adding on the weight from the stock half-size or hybrid skates, they'll add approximately 1.30 grams to the base weight, while the full-size skates add around 2.60 grams, and if you use the included grip aids, which you most likely won't need to do given the mouse's fantastic coating, they'll add around 0.51 grams to the mouse's weight. So in its stock configuration out of the box, the OP1 V2 weighs around 49.5 grams as advertised, and with the full-size skates installed, it'll weigh around 50.8 grams. In those same configurations, but with the addition of the grip aids, the respective weights increase to 50 grams and 51.3 grams, but keep in mind that due to the cable, there is a slight degree of error to my measurements here, so your unit might be slightly heavier or lighter, but not by a significant margin. But regardless, my OP1 V2, even with the stock grips installed, stays within the 49.5 plus minus 2 gram weight spec, and Endgame Gear has historically been very accurate with the weight spec, and I'm glad to see that continue here. That said though, I'm surprised Endgame Gear didn't push the mouse's weight down further, as weight is the most common gripe I hear about the OP1 series. However, since Endgame Gear's design philosophy is quality focused, similar to Vaxi's, I understand why they kept it on the heavier side for a mouse of this size, as it ensures the mouse's build quality remains perfect, and unlike many other brands, Endgame Gear designs their mice to be extremely moddable, and there are a myriad of ways to reduce the mouse's weight due to this. But in my opinion, the mouse's weight feels good to me, as this heavier quote-unquote weight gives the mouse a very controllable feeling in the hand, something I find lacking on many similarly sized ultralight mice. But in the future, I would love to see Endgame Gear offer two versions of their OP1 series mice, a standard quality focused model and an ultralight model. That way users could pick their preferred type, but we'll have to wait and see what Endgame Gear has planned for the OP1 series going forward. For axis balancing, the mouse, as expected for a symmetrical shape, is centrally balanced, but due to the forward position of the PCB and the lack of a battery, the mouse is balanced forward of its 59.1mm physical midline on its x-axis, being balanced roughly at the mouse's 67mm mark, roughly between the two side buttons. And on the mouse's y-axis, the mouse is centrally balanced on its physical midline, with no tilt to the mouse's left or right sides. Now circling back to the mouse's x-axis balancing, the mouse's balancing does have a slight range to it. As while it's centered on the 67mm mark, there is a 4mm range to it, giving the mouse a balancing range on its x-axis, resting between the 65 and 69mm mark. But keep in mind that since the mouse is wired, depending on the amount of strain that's applied to it, the mouse's balancing can be skewed forward quite significantly in some cases, but you can easily prevent this by using a mouse bungee, which I highly recommend doing so on any wired mouse. For shaping, Endgame Gear has kept the OP1 shape unchanged here on the V2, which is a very good decision in my opinion, as the shaping is very well designed and I'm glad they didn't alter it. Now this symmetrical shaping is right-hand optimized, though technically speaking it can be used ambidextrously, though left-handed users won't be able to utilize the mouse's side buttons. Now this shaping can be compared to many mice on the market, as it's similar in theory to the shaping we'll find on the Pulsar X2 series, but in reality the mouse is much thinner, specific towards the mouse's mid-region, and the top shell shaping, while similar, is thinner, specifically at the rear region. Compared to the Hitscan Hyperlite, the shaping is again similar, but the OP1 shell is thinner again, particularly at its forward region, and the top shell's curvature is similar, though the OP1 shell is less rounded, particularly at its mid-region. And compared to the Logitech 2C, again the shapes are similar at least in lengths, but again the OP1 shell is thinner at its upper region, and the top shell's curvature is similar at the rear region, but is significantly thinner towards the mid to forward region compared to the 2C. For dimensions, the OP1 V2 measures 118.2mm long. For widths, at the shell's forward region, at its base the shell measures approximately 50.3mm wide, whereas at its top region it measures approximately 55.3mm wide. At the shell's mid region, slightly above the mouse's physical midline, at its base the shell measures approximately 51.7mm wide, while at its top it measures approximately 50.5mm wide. And lastly, at the rear region of the shell, at its widest part of the rounded rear region, the shell measures approximately 16.5mm wide at its base. And for heights, at the shell's forward region, around the mid-region of the main clicks, the shell measures approximately 20mm tall, whereas at the peak of the shell's hump it measures approximately 37.2mm tall, and from its peak the top shell tapers downward, terminating at this lip towards the base, which measures around 8.4mm tall. For shell profiles, looking at the mouse from the top down, we can best see the familiar OP1 shaping, with its thinner top to mid region and wider rounded rear region. Flipping the mouse over, we can clearly see the aforementioned shaping, and we can better see the curvature of the mouse's side shell, which we'll talk more about in a moment. From the base, we can also see that the width difference between the top and base shells is rather minimal, as the base shell only widens a slight degree to match the width of the top shell. Looking at the mouse from the sides, we can best see the mouse's top shell curvature, which has the expected gently sloping forward to mid region, which peaks quite deeply in the shell's rear, and from the hump's peak, the top shell tapers downward, terminating at that aforementioned lip. Turning the mouse and looking at it from the front, we can see the more gently sloped forward shell region has a more flattened curvature compared to what we traditionally see on most symmetrical mice, which also applies to the shaping of the main clicks, giving them a slightly rounded, tilted shaping. From this perspective, we can also best see the profile of the mouse's side shells, which share the same curvature due to their symmetrical nature, at which at their forward region they are quite outwardly tilted with a slight roundness to their surface, and the shells maintain the same outward curvature towards the upper end of the mid region, where they become slightly more inwardly tilted, then revert their tilt to match the forward region's profile. Then at the lower end of the mid region, the side shells invert their shaping and widen, becoming slightly inwardly tilted as they meld into the rounded rear shell's shaping. And lastly, looking from the rear, we can best see the rear hump's profile, which unlike the flattened forward region is much more rounded, being more akin to the traditional rear shell curvature you'd find on many other symmetrical mice. For contact areas and points for my 25.4 by 10.16 cm hands using both a tilted claw and fingertip grip here on the OP1 AKV2. Starting with claw grip and focusing on palm contact first, the wider rear terminating hump with its traditional rounded shaping gives my palm's thenar region contact in its mid to low region, mid palm contact in its high region, and hypothenar contact in its mid to low regions. For finger contact while using a tilted claw grip here, in its natural position my thumb rests towards the upper region of the mouse's left side, but if needed I can angle my thumb inward, resting it slightly above where the side shell widens to meld into the rear shaping if more control is needed. For my index and middle fingers, they rest towards the end region of the shell buttons, and due to the slight grooving in the click surface, my fingers are slightly guided towards the center of the buttons. For my ring finger, it rests roughly opposite the position of my thumb's natural position, just slightly higher on the mouse's right side, whereas my pinky finger rests lower on the mouse's right side, resting right above where the side shell widens to meld into its rounded rear curvature, similar to where my thumb rests in its angled position on the mouse's left side. And when using a tilted fingertip grip here on the OP1 AKV2, in this grip style, my thumb rests more towards the middle of the mouse's side shell, being roughly aligned with the mouse's balancing point, whereas my index and middle fingers rest more towards the middle of the main clicks, but they are still guided to the middle of the clicks due to the slight grooving in their surface. While my ring finger rests roughly opposite of my thumb's position on the mouse's opposite side, while my pinky rests slightly below the position of my ring finger. But keep in mind I have very large hands and use a tilted grip style, so the way my hands work with the OP1 V2 shell won't be the same for everyone, but you can use my contact regions and points for estimates of how the mouse's shell will feel in your hand. For hand size and grip compatibility for the OP1 V2, given the mouse's smaller size and symmetrical nature and rearly positioned hump, just like the OP1 V1, the mouse is advertised as being best suited for claw and fingertip grips for small to medium sized hands, but in reality, as usual, the mouse's actual hand size and grip style compatibility is a little more universal than it appears or is advertised as. But before we talk about that, as a reminder, the mouse is right hand optimized but can be used ambidextrously, though left-handed users won't be able to utilize the side buttons. Now for hands measuring approximately 12.5 to 14.7 by 5 by 6.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for palm or claw grips. For hands measuring approximately 14.7 to 15.2 by 6.5 by 8 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for palm or claw grips. For hands measuring approximately 15.2 to 16.5 by 8 by 9.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for claw grips. For hands measuring approximately 16.5 to 19.8 by 9.5 to 10.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for claw grips again. For hands measuring approximately 17.8 to 19.1 by 10.5 to 11.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for claw and fingertip grips. For hands measuring approximately 19.1 to 20.3 by 11.5 to 12.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for claw and fingertip grips again. And lastly, for hands measuring approximately 20.3 to 21.6 by 12.5 to 13.5 centimeters, the mouse will again be best suited for fingertip grips, but you might be able to claw grip it in some situations, depending on your hand size. But keep in mind this is a very rough estimate, and the actual hand size and grip style compatibility for the mouse will vary from person to person. So if you're considering getting the OP1 V1 or V2, I'd recommend measuring the length of your hand from the tip of your middle finger to your proximal wrist crease, and the width of your hand by measuring the width of your knuckle excluding your thumb, and you can use these measurements to estimate if your hand size will be compatible with the OP1 V1 or V2. For coding, just like the previous iterations of the OP1 series and Endgame Gear's other mice, the V2 is using Endgame Gear's fantastic coding, which historically speaking has been one of the best coatings you can find on the market. Now, Endgame Gear describes the mouse's coating as a dry touch coating, which is accurate as to the touch the feeling is very chalky, but unlike many other coatings which have a balanced feel between rubberiness and chalkiness, the coating here is much more chalky focused, just as it was in the V1, with a very slight degree of rubberiness to it. This applies to both the black and white colorways, but it's worth noting that the coating on the Frost versions will have a slightly more rubberized texture to them, but the same performance. This unique coating blend gives the mouse's coating fantastic performance with both wet and dry hands, though it's worth noting that with sweatier hands the coating does become ever so slightly harder to grip due to lack of rubberiness, but this is only by a slight margin, and the coating allows the OP1 shell to be very grippable with almost all hand types. But just like all other great coatings, Endgame Gear's coating does attract dust and debris like a magnet does metal, same as we saw in the V1. Thankfully, buildup never affected the coating's performance, but it does visually affect the mouse from an aesthetics perspective. Now you can remove this buildup by wiping the shell with a dry microfiber cloth, but if you're particular about the aesthetics or appearance of your mouse, I'd recommend getting the lighter OP1 V2 colorways, as buildup is much less noticeable on these colorways compared to the darker ones. Now for the included grip aids, the ones included here are rather unique, as instead of including full-size pre-cut grips as we commonly see with most mice, just like the grips that were included with the OP1 V1, the V2 only includes two side covers, which are identical to the ones Endgame Gear has included with the previous iterations of the OP1. And just like the previous iterations of these grips, unfortunately they're still rather underwhelming compared to the grips included with other brands' products, as while they have a thinner form factor, their surface texturing is rather odd, having this hollow triangular texturing running across their surface, which to their credit does give the grips a semi-grippy feeling, at least with dry hands, but with wet hands the grips oddly become very slippery despite the texturing. And compared to the shell's fantastic coating, these grips don't offer as consistent performance, making them feel a little pointless here in all honesty. And while you can purchase full-size sets of grip aids from Endgame Gear's website, which are the same type as the one included here, in all honesty you'll be much better off purchasing aftermarket grips, as they'll not only come in superior form factors, they'll also have better performance, but seeing as the mouse's coating performs so well, I highly doubt anyone will need to use grip aids here or on any of Endgame Gear's mice for that matter, but on future iterations of Endgame Gear's mice, I would love to see them rework these grips, as the current offerings are rather lackluster to say the least. Ideally, if they could include grips that were similar to what G-Wolves includes with their products, that would be fantastic, as that is the golden standard for included grip aids in my opinion. For the OP1 V2's main clicks, unsurprisingly, the main clicks here are the same as the ones we found in the V1, being these longer rectangular buttons with rounded ends. And due to the flatter quote-unquote forward region's curvature, while the buttons are flatter than the ones you'll find on most symmetrical mice, they still do have a slight roundness to them, and they are also slightly angled, being the tallest towards the mouse's midline and slightly shorter towards their outer edges. And due to the button's slightly wave-like shaping, they do technically have a very slight grooving in their surface that runs from the end to mid region of the buttons, which does help to guide your fingers toward the middle of the buttons somewhat, but due to the grooving shallowness, the grooving provided by them isn't very strong, and they don't necessarily counteract the slightly tilted nature of the buttons as much as more pronounced groovings do on other main click designs. But despite this, the main clicks here are very easy to grip as they have the same coating applied to them that we'll find on the rest of the shell, which makes the buttons very grippable and prevents any grip related issues caused by the button's unique shaping or shallow grooving. And just like we saw in the V1, the main clicks here on the V2 are indented into the mouse's top shell as both buttons have a thin walling around their edges. This is a great attention to detail given the mouse's affinity for fingertip grips, which allows the main clicks to be free of any finger related interference issues with essentially every hand size and grip style out there. And for click heights, since the shell is symmetrical, both the buttons do share the same heights, as at their end region the buttons are around 14.5mm tall, whereas at their mid region they measure around 20mm tall, and at their top region the buttons measure around 27.2mm tall. For audio feedback, here's a quick sound test of the OP1 AK V2's main clicks. Inside the mouse we'll find two KL-GX switches which are mounted on their modular PCBs, just as we saw in the OP1 V1. These switches have been Endgame Gear's bread and butter, so to speak, as they offer fantastic performance and latency, as these switches use a dual actuation system which can be utilized in 3 different modes. In the normal or off mode, the switch operates in a traditional method where a click is inputted when the hammer makes contact with the switch's base contact. In GX safe mode, the switches operate with a double confirmation, meaning that before a click is actuated, the switch's top contact must be disconnected while the bottom one is connected. This serves as a hardware-based double click prevention, and speed-wise this method is almost on par with the normal or off mode, but offers many advantages when switches start to age. In the GX speed mode, in which compatible switches, as soon as the top contact is disconnected, a click is inputted, nearly instantaneously inputting an actuation and significantly reducing latency, as you don't have to wait for the switch's hammer to reach the bottom contact, which again reduces latency and travel times, giving the OP1 AK V2 its industry-leading click latency. These GX switches, as expected, are mechanical and are rated for an actuation weight of 55 to 60 grams, which is an accurate estimate as both of my main clicks feel around the 60 grams in their end to mid region, but they are slightly heavier, feeling around the 65 to 70 gram at their top region, but this is to be expected. For cycle rating, these switches are rated for 80 million cycles, the expected cycle rating we'll find on many switches, but unlike most switches, given their modular PCB, these switches can be replaced or modded extremely easily, and we'll talk more about this feature in a moment. For stabilization, both the main clicks are well stabilized, having only a slight degree of play to them even when actuated, but the buttons do have an ever so slight degree of wobble to them due to their wave-like shaping, but said wobble is extremely minimal and not noticeable during use. For travel, both the clicks have a low degree of pre-travel and a medium degree of post-travel. Admittedly, these ranges are longer than you'd expect to find here, but remember that due to the GX switches, the pre-travel is the only factor that will impact the click's performance when their speed mode is enabled, and both the main buttons have a very snappy rebound to them, which negates any downside to their travel ranges and allows the main clicks to be very responsive and spammable, especially with their speed mode enabled. And since these switches can be made hot swap with the OP1 switch pack, if needed you can apply a multi-click filter to the switches via the driver to help prevent double clicking or other click related issues, but we'll talk more about that later as well. And as a final note, due to the low pre-travel on the main clicks, when you use SPDT compatible switches here on the OP1, the clicks can be rather sensitive, meaning you might find the clicks easy to misactuate initially, but you can toggle the SPDT state per click via the software, and after a couple days of use you should acclimate to the button's more sensitive nature in their speed mode. As mentioned earlier in this video, Endgame Gear offers 2 optional switch packs for the OP1 series mice, both of which can alter or refine the main click's feel and performance, and since Endgame Gear was kind enough to send them over, I wanted to take a moment to talk about them as I didn't talk about them when I reviewed the V1. But as a quick preface to this segment, these switch packs are only compatible with the wired version of the OP1 AK and are not compatible with the wireless versions. The first switch pack set is an extra set of the KL-GX switches, which you can purchase for $6.99 USD. These switches are the same ones pre-installed in the OP1 AK, but these switches have been binned to have a slightly lighter actuation force, as they are rated for an actuation weight of 50 to 55 grams, whereas the stock ones, as we just talked about, are rated for 55 to 60 grams. So if one of your main click switches fails over the lifespan of the mouse, or you just want a slightly lighter actuation weight on the main clicks, you can purchase this switch set. The next switch set, and my personal favorite, is the OP1's Universal Switch Pack, which includes 2 hot swap PCBs that support both 3 and 2 pin switches, and extra mounting screws, and 7 sets of switches. This set retails for $19.99 USD and allows the OP1 to be used with essentially every mechanical switch type, as long as it's a 2 or 3 pin switch, and shares the same dimensions as the stock GX switches. All of the switches within this set are also binned to ensure their actuation weights are within a 5 gram force range, specifically the switches with wider actuation weight ranges, ensuring both the switches in the set have a similar click feel. Now, the first of the included switches here is the mel0n D2FC-FK, the mechanical variant, which are similar to the ones Logitech used in the GPX2. These switches are rated for an actuation weight of 45 to 70 grams, which is a wider range than we see on most switches, but due to their binning, both of them feel around 60 to 65 grams on my unit, and these switches are rated for 80 million cycles. These switches were one of my favorite switches included in the pack, as they had great performance. However, their wider estimated gram range does add a lot of variance to these switches, and I got lucky with a well-balanced set, but other sets might be heavier or lighter than the ones here, which will of course affect their click feel and performance, and here's how they sound. Next, we have a set of Wano transparent shell white dot switches, which are similar to many of Wano's other switch types, being rated for an actuation weight of around 50 to 55 grams, which is accurate on my switches. But unlike many of Wano's other switch types, these switches have a cycle rating of 100 million, not the typical 80 million we see. These switches, despite their lower actuation weight, do maintain the same Wano click feel we've come to expect from their switches, though it's a little softer in terms of its click feel due to lighter weight, which gives these switches a lighter, more spammable feel with increased durability, and these gave the switches surprisingly good performance compared to the other Wano switches, and here's how they sound. Next, we have the ever popular, albeit overused, Wano blue shell pink dot switches, which are rated for an actuation rate of around 55 to 60 grams, which is accurate on my switches, and these switches also have the expected cycle rating of 80 million cycles. These switches feel like a slightly firmer, more tensioned version of the white dots we just talked about, but they have the most typical Wano click feel, and they do perform well, but I personally prefer the lighter, snappier white dot versions. But regardless, I'm glad to see them included here, as you can use them to give the mouse a normal quote-unquote click feel compared to the other included switches, and here's how they sound. Next, we have the most unique switches included here in this pack in the form of 2 Wano silent switches. These switches are rated for an actuation rate range of 50 to 60 grams, which I'd say feel more akin to the 65 to 70 gram force on my switches here, and they have the second lowest cycle rating of the switch pack, being rated for only 20 million cycles. These switches trade performance for acoustics, as the switches are nearly silent, which makes the switches, to be frank, god-awful for gaming, as the click feels extremely spongy, but they're ideal for using the mouse in an office or sound-sensitive environment, which, while admittedly is a niche situation, I'm still glad to see them included here despite their poor gaming performance, and here's how they sound. Next, we have a set of TTC's Dustproof Gold switches, which are rated for an actuation rate of 55 to 65 gram force, which are on the heavier side of this rating on my switches, feeling around the 65 gram range, and they have the expected cycle rating of 80 million cycles. These switches were actually quite good, as they had a nice crisp click feel with a good rebound and sharp click sound, and they performed really well over my testing, which has been my experience with most of TTC's switches, despite them not being very popular. In addition to their solid performance, they are fully dustproof, which gives them superior long-term durability compared to other switch types, but they lack any SPDT support, which did hamper their performance compared to the GX switches, but regardless, they're a nice option to see included here, and here's how they sound. Next, we have one of the most unique switches included here, being these zippy DF3-P1 switches, which are rated for an actuation weight of 50 to 80 grams, which feel more akin to a 65 to 70 gram force range on my set, but oddly, these switches have the lowest cycle rating out of all the switches included here, being rated for only 5 million cycles. These switches actually have a very unique click feeling, as they feel like a softer version of the mel0n switches we talked about a moment ago. They also have a rather unique click sound and surprisingly solid performance, but their low durability does hamper their long-term usage, but they're a cool option to see included here, as I've never used a zippy switch until now, and if these switches had a more traditional cycle rating, they'd probably be my favorite, but regardless, they're a cool switch to see included here despite their lower cycle rating, and here's how they sound. And lastly, we have what is my favorite switch from the switch pack here, which are another rather unique switch called the HNCHK pink dot switches. These switches are rated for an actuation weight of 60 to 70 grams, which is accurate, though my switches are on the heavier side of this range, feeling around a 65 to 70 gram force. These switches also have the highest cycle rating out of all the switches in the pack, as they're rated for 150 million cycles, giving them the best durability out of all the switches here. Now these switches, despite their less than popular nature, are quite good, and they had a fantastic click feel and crisp acoustics and great performance, and on the switch pack's product page, EGG describes these switches as being exotic, and that's probably the best way I can describe these switches, but like the other unique switches in the pack, these ones had the best performance by far and the best durability, and I really hope we see other brands adopt these switches in the future, as they're really damn good, and here's how they sound. And just to show the universal compatibility here, the hotspot PCB also works with ROG Mechanical Microswitch Gen 2s, and they function totally fine over my testing, as did all the other mechanical switch types I tested. But overall, both of these switch packs are an amazing offering from Endgame Gear, and these hotspot PCBs specifically are fantastic and well worth the additional cost in my opinion, as not only do these PCBs allow you to customize the mouse's click feel, they also make the mouse's long-term durability and serviceability astronomically better than 99% of mice available on the market, and I hope we see EGG continue to offer these switch packs on their future products. And as a final note, keep in mind that the mouse's latency values will be affected by whatever switch you install to replace the stock GX switches, so keep that in mind, as when it comes to the mouse's performance, the GX switches will always be the best in terms of performance, as they're the custom switches developed by Endgame Gear and they're optimized for the OP1 8K. For side clicks, the OP1 V2 uses the same button design found on the V1, being the same thinner, curved buttons, with the same smaller forward button and larger rear button, both of which have uniquely peaked surfaces towards their inner edges and a flattened surface toward their outer edges. Both of these buttons are slightly curved to match the top shell's profile, and the side buttons are positioned forward of the mouse's 59.1mm physical midline, and slightly forward of the 62mm sensor position, roughly at around the 63.5mm mark, which is a nice attention to detail, as it allows the side buttons to be usable with essentially every hand size and grip style. But due to the unique shaping of the side buttons, at their inner edges they're quite pronounced due to the peak, but at their outer edges they're quite flat, which makes the surface of the buttons quite uneven, which is a positive and a negative in some cases, as while the buttons have the same coating applied to them as the rest of the shell, the more pronounced regions are rather difficult to grip, whereas the flatter areas are much easier to grip. This is rather odd, as at a first glance you'd assume they'd be the opposite given their design, and another questionable aspect to the buttons is the gapping, as while there is one, it's very thin, and if you actuate the buttons on their taller inner edges, it's very easy to misactuate the opposite button here, whereas toward the forward regions you don't have this issue, but due to their flattened nature they're kinda hard to press. Now to be fair, the side buttons, despite their uniqueness, are usable, but I do wish Endgame Gear would have redesigned the buttons here in the V2, as wider, slightly taller buttons with a flattened even surface and a larger gapping between them would be far superior to the ones currently used by the mouse in my opinion. In terms of click audio, here's a quick sound test of the OP1 8K V2 side buttons. Inside, and just as we saw in the OP1 V1, we'll find a PCB with two KLGM 2.0 switches installed on it, which just like the rest of the switches on this unit are binned to ensure consistency in their actuation weights. These switches are rated for an actuation weight of around 70 grams, but due to the binning, the buttons here are a little lighter, feeling more akin to a 65 gram range in my opinion, which is a nice improvement coming from the V1 side buttons as they're a little more spammable. And for cycle rating, unlike most brands which use switches with 3 or 5 million cycle ratings, these switches have a rating of 20 million cycles, which is a great attention to detail and something I think a lot of other brands would benefit from mimicking on their products, as the higher the cycle rating, the longer the longevity of the side buttons will be. For stabilization, the side buttons are decently stabilized, but the unique heights does introduce a surprising degree of wobble to the buttons, more so to the rear one than the forward one due to the differing size, but while this doesn't necessarily impact performance, it does make the buttons feel odd, an issue that would be resolved by flattening the buttons and keeping them consistent in their heights. For travel ranges, both buttons have a very low degree of pre-travel and a rather low degree of post-travel, and due to them using full-size switches here, the side buttons also have very snappy rebounds, which gives the side buttons a high degree of spammability. And just like we saw in the main clicks, if needed you can apply a multi-click filter to the side buttons, so if you run into any issues or mod the switch itself for alternative ones and you need to adjust the filter for compatibility, you can do so via the driver. And as a last note, just like the main click PCB which connects to the mainboard via 3-pin JST connectors, the side button PCB also connects to the mainboard via JST connector, but this one is a larger 4-pin typing, meaning if a side button switch fails or if you want to mod the switch, you can do so very easily, which is yet another fantastic feature to see here. For scroll wheel, this is an area where Endgame Gear has made some interesting changes coming from the V1, as while the wheel physically is the same, the encoder is very different, but before we talk about that, let's talk about the wheel itself. As just mentioned, the wheel is the same typing we saw in the OP1 V1, being a plastic wheel with a very thick rubber texturing wrapped around it. This rubber has a linear texturing etched into its slightly rounded surface, which allows the scroll wheel to be very grippable, just as we saw in the V1. And the scroll wheel is also rather pronounced in the mouse's top shell, again just like we saw in the V1, which allows the wheel to have a full scroll range of 10 points and makes it very easy to utilize. On the inside, instead of using the TTC white encoder we saw used on the V1, Endgame Gear has swapped the encoder here on the V2 to a Kale Gray dustproof 24-step encoder, which is a unique change as this encoder is significantly stronger than the TTC one used before, as the scroll voice is roughly double that of the TTC encoder. In addition to this, it also has stronger scroll points, which allows this new encoder to feel very controllable, almost too controllable some might say, and it's free of any click related or scroll related issues from my testing. The reason for this change is durability, as TTC's encoders, as you heard me yap about many times already, are a little lacking in terms of longevity and durability, and while they perform well, they're rather prone to issues, just as we saw in the OP1 V1. This is why Endgame Gear went for the more stronger, more durable Kale encoder here on the V2 to try and avoid the issues that plagued the V1. And for scroll wheel switch, inside we'll find the same Kale GM 2.0 full-size switch we saw used for the side buttons, which just like those switches is binned and rated for an actuation weight of around 70 grams with the same cycle rating of 20 million. This is another great attention to detail here, as just like the side buttons, many mice use pillar switches with 3 to 5 million cycle ratings, which on top of having that spongy click feel, aren't as durable as full-size switches, and I'm really glad to see Endgame Gear keep the full-size switch here on the V2 for this reason. But this switch, unlike the side button switches, feels more akin to its rated 70 gram actuation weight, but it's actually a little heavier on my unit, feeling around a 70 to 75 gram range, which isn't an issue per se, but it does make the scroll wheel click notably heavier than the rest of the mouse's buttons, which will take some time to get accustomed to. For travel, the wheel click has a very low degree of both pre and post travel, and because the switch is full size, not a pillar switch, the wheel click has a very snappy rebound and great click feel, which helps to offset the heavier actuation weight, making the wheel decently spammable. And just like the rest of the OP1 V2's buttons, you can also apply a multi-click filter here to the scroll wheel if needed, which is yet again another great attention to detail. For sensor and MCU, this is where we'll find the core improvements to the V2 here, as the mouse's sensor has been significantly improved compared to the V1, but before we talk about the improved sensor itself, let's talk about its positioning. As I mentioned earlier, the sensor is positioned ever so slightly forward of the mouse's 59.1mm physical midline, being positioned at roughly the 62mm mark, slightly behind the mouse's 65 to 69mm balancing range. Due to this positioning, and of course depending on your grip style or hand size, there might be a small acclimation period when first using the OP1 V2, as the sensor is not only slightly disjointed for the mouse's balancing range, it can also sit very low in your grip style, especially if you have larger hands, but after a couple days of use you should acclimate to the sensor's position and the mouse's balancing without issue. For the sensor, instead of using the PAW 3395DM-T6QU as the V1 did, the V2 is sporting a fully custom PAW 3950U plus 1F95A, which is a heavily tweaked version of the PAW 3950 we see used by essentially every brand on the market now. This sensor has a DPI range of 10 to 30,000, which is adjustable by 10 DPI steps below 10,000 DPI and 50 DPI steps above 10,000, and the DPI can be configured on both the X and Y axis, which is a great attention to detail skipped by many brands. For IPS, the sensor is rated for 750, and for acceleration, the sensor is rated for 50 grams, the typical ranges we see on most 3950s. The sensor also supports ripple, angle snapping, and motion sync, all of which can be toggled via the mouse's driver. But for LOD, uniquely, instead of using the preset values we commonly see on most if not all 3950 implementations, being 0.71 and 2mm, Endgame Gear has opted to use a custom range here, as the sensor supports LODs from 0.7 to 1.7mm, and you can adjust the level by 0.1mm increments, which is an amazing feature I've only seen on Razor's mice to date, and allows the LOD to be super customizable, something I'd love to see other brands adapt. This sensor, as expected, also supports sensor tilting, but instead of having the usual 66-degree range we commonly see, Endgame Gear has expanded the range to 254 degrees, the widest tilt range I've seen on a mouse to date. This is an amazing tweak here, as it allows the sensor to be fully compatible with any tilted grip style, and you won't be relying on third-party programs like RawXL to tilt the sensor to certain degrees. And while not many people utilize the sensor tilt feature, it's a feature everyone should be trying out, as it not only significantly improves your ergonomics, it also improves your aim and consistency. And if you want to learn more about sensor tilting and how it works and how it could benefit your aim, check out my full guide, which will be linked on screen here and down in the video description. And another unique aspect to this sensor is that since the OP1 is a wired mouse, this allows the mouse's sensor to run at its max performance at all times, without the many power saving parameters you'll find applied to wireless mice's sensors, just as we saw in the V1. This further improves the V2's performance, and is a big reason as to why Endgame Gear's wired mice feel so responsive, as the wired nature allows you to get the max out of the mouse's hardware. And lastly, for MCU, just as we saw in the OP1 V1, the V2 is using the same Nuvoton M483 MCU, which is a unique MCU type we don't see used too often, especially when compared to the ever popular Nordic SoCs we see used in almost every mouse on the market. The reason that Endgame Gear opted to use the M483 here is because this MCU supports 8K Hz natively, whereas the 52840 only supports up to 1K Hz natively and requires a separate controller to utilize higher polling rates. As such, Endgame Gear opted to use this unique MCU as opposed to traditional ones, and just like we saw in the V1, the implementation of the MCU here on the V2 is perfect and delivers stellar performance across the board. For connectivity, as a surprise to no one, the OP1 V2 supports only wired connectivity, as well, it's a wired mouse, so that's kind of to be expected, whereas the WE variant of the OP1 supports both wired and wireless connectivity types. But even though the OP1 only supports one connectivity type, as I've mentioned several times in this video, the performance offered here is second to none in my opinion, as all the mouse's report rates are perfectly implemented with flawless performance across the board here. As a preface to this segment, several months ago there was a malware issue with Endgame Gear's software, but this issue has been resolved and there are no security issues with their software as of this video being recorded. However, when you launch the software, Windows Smart Screen will likely prevent the program from running, warning you about a virus. To be abundantly clear, this is not because there is a security risk from the program, this is because Smart Screen disables EXEs downloaded from the web by running. So if you see this Smart Screen notice pop up, just click continue and you can utilize the program without issue. Alright, with that little preface out of the way, let's talk about the software itself. Now, compared to the software drivers we see from other brands, Endgame Gear's driver is a little basic looking, but despite its appearance, the driver is very well implemented, just as it was when I talked about the V1. Upon opening the driver, it will open to a large rectangular window which has 3 sub-menus. At the top of this window, the driver lists the mouse's firmware and software version, and there is a button at the top to factory reset the mouse. At the very bottom of the window, there is an apply button, which you'll need to click to apply any changes made to the mouse's settings, as it doesn't autosave, so keep this in mind. In the first tab called Basic Settings, we can adjust the mouse's LOD levels from 0.7 to 1.7 millimeters. We can also enable or disable angle snapping, ripple, configure the base LED settings, allow for differing X and Y axis DPI values, and select the number of CPI levels on the mouse between 1 and 4, and you can set each of these levels between 10 to 30,000. In the next tab called the Advanced Settings, we can enable or disable motion sync, adjust the mouse's polling rate from 1 to 8 kHz, enable or disable a slam click filter which will be enabled by default, enable or disable the mouse's glass mode which will allow the sensor to track on transparent glass with a thickness of 4 millimeters or thinner. However, this will cap the mouse's report rate to 1 kHz, and you do not need to use this mode on traditional hard pad types, only transparent glass. Below these options, we have a bunch of click related settings, including the multi-click filters for the main, side, and scroll wheel, and we can also configure the main click's SPDT state between the 3 aforementioned modes: normal or off, GX safe, and GX speed. But keep in mind that the multi-click filter here is not the same as a debounce filter, and they don't affect the mouse's latency, and to tweak these settings you'll need to check a little box at the base here. Now by default, the mouse's SPDT state will be disabled, so be sure to set it to the GX speed mode to take advantage of the switch's fantastic performance, but if you swap the switches to ones that don't support these speed modes, this feature won't work, so keep this in mind, and if you do so, make sure to set this feature off or use the GX safe mode. Lastly, for this tab at the base, we'll find the mouse's sensor tilt feature, which allows the sensor to be rotated by 127 degrees both positively and negatively, giving the sensor the aforementioned total tilt range of 254 degrees, which is the widest tilt range I've seen on a mouse to date. And in the last tab called button mapping, we can adjust the mouse's keybinds, and the options are pretty thorough, which is nice to see, and you can also set the mouse to a left-handed mode, which will swap the mouse's binds to make it optimized for left-hand usage. But overall, the OP1 V2 software experience is great, just as it was on the V1, and even though it is a very no-frills approach to a driver, it is very well implemented. But in the future, I'd love to see Endgame Gear make a web driver for their products, as that is becoming the new standard, and seeing a web driver as an option for their mice would be a great improvement in the future. And for repairability, just as we saw in the OP1 V1, the V2 serviceability is industry leading in my opinion, as not only is the mouse incredibly easy to open, the main click PCB, side click PCB, and power cable are all modular, meaning repairing or replacing these components is incredibly easy, and on top of that, the rest of the mouse is incredibly easy to service, which is awesome to see, and the main board, in addition to being much smaller than the V1's PCB, is moddable too, as we talked about earlier, which is yet another great attention to detail here. And as mentioned at the top of this video, the mouse includes a screwdriver, which isn't something unique to Endgame Gear, as other brands have included drivers with their products, but other brands' drivers are less than usable, whereas the driver here is sized quite well, and you can use it to fully disassemble the mouse without needing any additional tools, which is a really cool thing to see. And if you're interested in learning more about how to service the OP1 AK V2, or just want to learn more about the mouse's internals, how to repair its modular components, or learn about the mouse's modding options or component weights, get subscribed so you don't miss the OP1 AK V2's teardown video, which we'll be releasing in a couple days. And for stock skates, the V2, while it does use the same style of skates we saw used on the V1, have been notably improved, as the skates adhesive on the V1s were frankly a nightmare to remove, as their adhesive would stick to the base shell when torn off, and this residue was very difficult to remove, which made using aftermarket skates on the OP1 V1 a rather annoying process. But here on the V2, the skates adhesive have been updated to a thicker type that doesn't tear when removed or leave any residue behind, making the process of replacing the stock skates or using aftermarket ones significantly easier, which is a massive improvement over the V1. Now, the skates themselves, as I just mentioned, are the same type we saw used on the V1, one being the pre-installed hybrid set and the other being the larger full-size set. Both of these skates material is 100% PTFE, which allows these skates to perform very well on soft pad types, and to my surprise, the skates also perform decently well on hard pad types, but due to their PTFE nature, their durability was a little lacking, and because of this I opted to use aftermarket skates over the majority of my testing, but I'll talk about that experience in a moment. But before I do, I have to mention what is probably my favorite skate-related feature here, as Endgame Gear has designed their skates to ensure the base access screws are accessible regardless of the type you use. This is a very underrated feature, as it allows you to open the mouse and swap the switches or repair a component or do whatever you want with the mouse without damaging the skates, something you rarely find on the market, as almost every brand on the market covers said access screws with skates, meaning you'll have to replace said skates if you have to service the mouse, leading to unnecessary waste. And I'm so glad to see this feature continue here on the V2, and I really hope to see it continue on Endgame Gear's future products. However, oddly, Endgame Gear still hasn't installed any skate removal ramps on the mouse's base, which thankfully isn't too much of an issue here as the skates are so easy to remove due to their improved adhesive, but on a future model of the OP1 AK, it would be nice to see these added to make the removal process even easier. And circling back to the usage experience of aftermarket skates, just like we saw in the V1, the V2 skate channels are extremely thin and they're quite wide, allowing the mouse to be fully compatible with essentially every type of aftermarket skate available on the market, which is very helpful as I used a hard pad for the majority of my testing, and since the stock skates, while they did perform well, weren't the most durable on hard pads, I was able to use the Glassworks dots that were included with the Polarity on the V2 without issue, and those skates felt and performed significantly better than the stock skates did on the Polarity. So regardless of the pad type you use your OP1 AK on, you'll be able to use some kind of aftermarket skate or the stock skates on it without issue. But while Endgame Gear has done a fantastic job improving the stock skates and the experience of using aftermarket skates here on the V2, I do have to critique them for not including any hard pad optimized skates, as that is becoming the standard, and I'd love to see hard pad optimized dots included on a future version of the OP1. And lastly, let's talk about the OP1 V2's cable, which is the same FlexCord 5.0 cable we saw used on the V1, which is a good thing as that cable was very well implemented, and the same can be said about the cable here. For length, the cable is 160mm long and is a fairly thin cable which is wrapped with a soft paracord that's quite low friction, allowing it to glide over both soft and hard pad surfaces without too much drag. The cable, due to its thinness, is also quite flexible, allowing for even more freedom when using the mouse, and the mouse end of the cable is tilted upwards, which further reduces the cable's drag. But even though you can use the OP1 AK as is due to the great cable implementation, as I say for all wired mice, I'd highly recommend using a bungee, of which the mouse is universally compatible, as that'll drastically improve the usage experience and give the mouse a near wireless feel, with the proper bungee of course. Personally speaking, I used a Pulsar ES bungee with the mouse over testing, and I didn't run into any cable related issues, so I'd recommend getting that bungee for the best use case here on the OP1, or any other wired mouse for that matter. And as I mentioned earlier, since the cable is modular being connected with this wider JST plug, if the cable fails or is damaged, you can replace the cable easily without having to replace the whole mouse, which is a great attention to detail. And you can purchase a replacement cable from Endgame Gear for $8.99 USD, or from other retailers who offer modded cables for the OP1 series, of which there are several options. Alright, in closing, overall the OP1 AK V2 is an incredibly impressive mouse from Endgame Gear, with fantastic accessories, a great weight, significantly improved internals, and a fantastic shaping that's unchanged from the V1, which is very well weight balanced for a wired mouse. The mouse's coding performance is amazing too, being one of the best coatings you'll find on the market. The mouse's main click implementation is borderline flawless, and the KLGX switches continue to deliver industry-leading performance, and the optional switch packs are an amazing add-on to the mouse, specifically in the form of the hot swap PCBs, and while the scroll wheel is significantly improved from the V1, the new encoder is much heavier, which might be too heavy from some users, but it is a good improvement, and Endgame Gear's custom 3950 implementation is a notable aspect to the mouse, as it has an incredibly wide tilt range and the best LOD implementation I've seen to date, and it has great performance across the board. The mouse's polling rates are perfectly implemented as expected, and the mouse's software is good, but I would like to see a WebDriver released in the future. And of course, the mouse's repairability is superb and is industry leading in my opinion. The mouse's stock skates are significantly improved and perform great on soft pad types, and the mouse has fantastic aftermarket skate compatibility, and the cable is very well implemented and performs great, though I still recommend using a bungee with it, and if needed it can be repaired or replaced easily. However, while there's a lot of great things about this mouse, it's not perfect, as the included grip aids are rather underwhelming, and the side buttons are the weakest aspect to the mouse in my opinion, as they're shaping is rather odd and makes them a little awkward to use, and hopeful to see these buttons reworked on a future OP1 series product. And lastly, the mouse doesn't include any hard pad optimized skates, which is disappointing. But overall, I am very impressed with the OP1 AK V2, and even though on the surface there don't appear to be any big changes here, under the hood a lot has improved, and the V2 is more than capable of continuing the legacy set by the OP1 AK V1. And if you have the OP1 V1 and were considering upgrading, the V2 is a fantastic improvement over the V1, and it fixed every single issue I had with the V1, and the mouse feels, performs, and is overall a very solid offering from Endgame Gear. But with that, that's everything for today's episode of the mel0n Review. Thank you very much again for watching, and thanks to Endgame Gear for sending over the OP1 AK V2 over for review. If you would like to support my efforts here on the channel with these super in-depth reviews and of course the Teardown project, consider becoming a member here on YouTube, as that is the best way to directly support the channel, and being a member also gives you early access to all upcoming content. So if you want to support what I do here on the channel, become a channel member today. Thanks again for watching my review of the OP1 AK V2, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n Review. Peace.